Progress.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to our weekly media briefing and public health update with Montgomery County Executive Marc Elrich. I'm Lorna Vigili, Hispanic Public Information Officer, and joining us today is Dr. Keisha Davis, who is the county's health officer, as well as Mr. Dr. Earl Stoddard, Assistant Chief Administrative Officer. And our guests today are Dr. Scott Bruton, Director of the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, as well as Christine Hong. She's the Chief of Services to End and Prevent Homelessness, also for the Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Mr. County Executive, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us. And sorry I was a few minutes late getting here. First of all, I want everyone to know that last week we knew the hurricane was on its way to the U.S. and I think no one could have anticipated the impact that Helene had on parts of the South. It was definitely worse than even the worst cases that I had, that seemed to have been projected. On Sunday, Maryland Task Force 1 was sent to North Carolina, where power was knocked out to hundreds of thousands of people, and drinking water has become scarce. I also want to recognize the work done by the Maryland National Guard's helicopter aquatic rescue team. They were also in Asheville, North Carolina, and nearby towns, lifting people and getting their pets out of danger. We're proud to have a Montgomery County Fire and Rescue Service Master Firefighter on that team, and for anyone wanting to help, I would point them to the American Red Cross Disaster Response Team. There is enormous need right now, and the need is immediate. It's not going to, it needs, people need support now. And the length of time it's going to take to get supplies to these areas, people are going to be suffering in a huge way. As somebody who's actually been to Asheville, it's hard to imagine that a hurricane could have had an effect on a city that's so far removed from the ocean, but it did. In other news, there's a port workers strike going on around the nation, including more than 2,000 longshoremen at the Port of Baltimore, and they're on strike after their contract expired at midnight on Tuesday. I've always stood in solidarity with workers over management during strikes. I fully support the International Longshoremen Association, the right to strike in order to receive higher wages and better working conditions, as long as workers aren't part of the fundamental decision-making in terms of how a county or a private business goes about compensating its employees. The only tool that the union has is to go on strike. And if it comes to that, I've always been happy and willing to support it, and I support the work they're doing now. It is a dangerous and dirty job, and they do it in the worst of all conditions. Freight doesn't stop getting unloaded because it's snowing, raining, boiling hot, or freezing cold. And I'm just, this industry is critical to the state of our economy, and I'm hoping that this strike gets resolved quickly, that both parties come to a table and get a settlement that is fair and doesn't disrupt the ability of the companies to make money, but also doesn't force workers to work for lower wages than they deserve. And we'll see how this plays out. Hopefully it will not last long. I want to update on the Afghan refugee eviction situation. A few weeks ago, we learned about dozens of impending evictions at a property in the Silver Spring called the Enclave. We discovered that many of those impacted were refugees from Afghanistan, families that were settled here by the federal government because of their cooperation with the U.S. during the war with the Taliban. And it was impossible to leave them behind because they most likely would have been killed. And I think everybody recognizes that. I'm glad to report that after intense negotiations with property owners, our Department of Health and Human Services representatives have come to terms to keep at least 10 families in their homes. Others are still at risk of losing their homes, and they may be relocated to areas that are more affordable. One of the important aspects of this intervention is that we can now identify services and opportunities to help families and minimize these sorts of situations down the road. I'm hoping that we can create further cooperation, because while the county government and related agencies have been working together, there's a lot of private effort that has been focused on these refugees as well as other refugees on the county. They've expressed an interest in meeting with us to see what we can do to develop more coordinated efforts, and I'm looking forward to facilitating that meeting. I want to commend my team for working with the courts and the sheriff's office to identify ways to improve communications. And I also want to thank the council members, state officials, and federal officials who've been working with us as we address the problem. In September, as it ended anyway, we received good news on the affordable housing front from the Affordable Housing Pipeline Report, which looks at county finance projects quarterly. We closed on 2 loans in the first quarter of FY25 with development partners that will help produce 334 affordable apartments, Amber Commons in Gaithersburg and the Montour site in North Bethesda. For the remainder of FY25, we anticipate closing loans for several other development projects in our pipeline that will produce or preserve an additional 1,424 affordable units. So we'd have a total of 1,758 affordable units for the year. For context, in FY24, we closed 17 projects that produced 1,133 affordable units, and we also closed 13 projects that produced or preserved 975 units. I would consider these figures a success and a big win for thousands of families across Montgomery County. These are just the affordable housing units that we preserved or produced. There are more units that were created through the private sector solely. Creating and expanding affordable opportunities is one of our toughest and most complicated challenges, and I've ensured that we continue to be aggressive in seeking every advantage that we have in terms of preserving existing properties and making that a priority. I especially want to thank the work that HOC did in Bethesda to take multiple properties that were scheduled. These were affordable 3-story brick buildings that were scheduled to be displaced, and the new project would have had a fraction of the affordable housing that the existing units had, which is really disturbing because they were going to triple the density. So I was very grateful for HOC's intervention there. When I was a council member, I led an effort to focus on rental properties with serious housing code violations, and that resulted in the publication of the annual troubled properties list. This list divides multifamily properties inspected that year into 3 categories based on the number and severity of housing code violations that were discovered. You were either compliant, at risk, or troubled. We recently released the FY24 report, which found that more than 75% of multifamily apartment buildings inspected were designated compliant. A little over 10% were determined to be at risk, and of the remaining 13% were deemed troubled. The FY23 report found that 83% of inspected properties were compliant, nearly 8% were at risk, and just under 9% were troubled. We are going to work on that troubled property risk list, and as well as the at-risk properties. We put these lists together to help property owners and keep them accountable. Property owners play a vital role in the community as they're responsible for providing and preserving one of the most basic human necessities, shelter. We asked the renters concerned about a property alert our housing department and community affairs department issued. The county's 311 phone line took over 10,000 requests last year for safety and maintenance upkeep concerns for all types of residential and commercial properties, as well as for vacant lots. One of the things that's not attached to our policy, but something we've been pushing at the state level, is just cause eviction. And we do that because tenants who file complaints with the housing department and ask for housing inspections are disproportionately affected by requests for eviction. And because the state doesn't have a just cause eviction law, a tenant can be evicted for simply calling HOC, or not HOC, the county's housing department, and asking for a housing inspection. No one should lose their housing because they're asking that their property be brought up to livable standards. And hopefully this is the year that we'll get the legislation through the legislature. So this is one thing the tenants don't have to be afraid of. Before I turn to Director Bruton, I want to also recognize that yesterday marked the enaction of many new state laws. One of the most important and relevant to this conversation was the enaction of the Tenant Safety Act of 2024. This law empowers tenants to hold landlords accountable for conditions of disrepair that threaten life, health, or safety. The new law clarifies that tenants in the same building with similar defects may join together in one case. In other words, they don't have to go individually to court. This is important because going through a legal process can be quite intimidating, and now multiple tenants can work together with a single lawyer. Additionally, the landlord may have to pay for tenants' attorney fees if the tenant wins. I want to thank delegates Vaughn Stewart and Senator Sarah Love from our state delegation for the work on the bill, and I believe this bill will help our efforts to ensure safer housing units and communities and increase landlord accountability by treating their tenants with the respect and dignity that they deserve. This law gives us the teeth we need to ensure the buildings are safe and habitable. So I'd like to bring on our Director of Housing and Community Affairs, Scott Bruton, to talk about the county's efforts on troubled properties and affordable housing throughout these reports. Also joining us is Christine Hong. She's the Chief of Services to End and Prevent Homelessness in our HHS department, and she's been working directly with the Afghan refugees at the Enclave and the community organizations that are trying to assist them. So I'm going to turn this over now to Scott Bruton and Christine Hong.
Christine, would you like to go first, or should I?
You go first.
Okay. So thank you, County Executive Elrich, for bringing attention to these important rental housing issues in the county. I'll speak first about the new quarterly affordable housing pipeline report. We provide this to the county executive and to the council on a quarterly basis, and have been doing so since the second quarter of fiscal year 2022. Important note is that in the statistics that the county executive mentioned, as the county executive and the council have collaborated together to include in the budget increasing amounts for the preservation and production of affordable housing, we have been able to increase the numbers of affordable housing created and preserved in the county. So we have definitely delivered for the money that's been invested. I will define affordable for any in the media who are interested in that particular aspect. When we say affordable units, we qualify those as affordable to households that are at or below 30% of AMI on up to 70% of the area median income for the Washington metropolitan area. And in the properties that we help preserve and create these units, we have units that are affordable at the range from 30 to 40, 50, 60, and 70% of area median income. And happy in the question period to answer any questions you may have about that. Also, regarding the troubled properties report, we have been putting out annually the troubled property report since fiscal year 2019. And we put out the most recent version a few days ago for fiscal year 2024. In previous years, being designated as an at-risk or troubled property was more of a notification to a landlord, and the landlord would go through a process, hopefully, to remedy the housing code violations that were brought to light by these annual inspections. With the passage of the rent stabilization law last year, and it's going into effect this past July, there are now significantly more consequences for being designated as an at-risk or troubled property. The most basic is that landlords at these properties are not able to increase the rents on their units. And so landlords have, under the existing troubled property law and regulation, certain steps that they can take in order to be removed from a troubled or at-risk designation and have that replaced with a compliant designation. And we will be working, we here at DHCA will be working with landlords that have those designations to help them go through that process so that they can clean up the housing code violations and move on into the compliant category and improve housing conditions for the tenants at their properties. And as a reminder, housing code violations and our housing code inspections, we view those not as just making sure buildings are in proper repair. this is also most importantly a public health function. This is about making sure that that tenants live in safe, healthy environments in their apartments. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Hall to talk about the refugee status.
Thanks, Director Bruton. So Services to End and Prevent Homelessness with the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services has been working with the 36 refugee families at the enclave that are facing eviction. We are partnering with the Maryland Office of Refugees and Asylees, as well as the refugee resettlement agencies that had been working with the families when they first arrived in the U.S. We're also working with the Muslim Community Center to help to ensure that we're providing culturally appropriate and competent services to the families. There are some cultural barriers in them attaining self-sufficiency. And our hope is that we can prevent nearly all of the evictions that they're facing. Some of the families will have to make the difficult decision to relocate if they're not able to sustain their rent at the enclave. But our partnership with the state will allow us to help the families pay off their arrearages in addition to what the county can invest so that they can remain housed, which is of utmost importance to us. And we appreciate all of the concern from the community and the support coming from the community as well.
Thank you very much to the two of you, members of the media. We are going to open it up right now for questions regarding these particular topics. The Troubled Property Report, affordable housing, and the efforts to assist and help the Afghan refugees. I see we have some, we have Kelly Lean, ABC7. Go ahead, good afternoon.
Hello there. This is about affordable housing, but it deals with the discussion that happened today with the public hearing on the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative. I'm just wondering, Mr. Elrich, what would you like to see come next? Also, with all of this intense interest from the community, has that had any impact on where you stand on this issue? And even if it has or hasn't, we'd like to know where you do stand, please.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I guess, I've been opposed to this initiative from Park and Planning as soon as I understood what it was they were doing. I was going to talk about this a little bit later in the growth and infrastructure policy, so let's just please pay attention to what I say then, because I don't want to say it twice. But basically, there's no affordable housing in this plan. And what you'll see later on the screen is a slide that shows they actually were asked the question about, is this about affordable housing? And they said, no, it's not. It's about market rate housing, and the market will set the price. Market never sets a price for affordable housing. The market doesn't build affordable housing on its own. Whatever affordable housing we get are fractions of developments that are larger developments that have to meet county requirements for affordability. The number of units we produce is far less than are actually needed. The other big issue, and I'll come back to this again later, is that unlike some cities where they have a truly constrained environment, if you look at Montgomery County's master plans, we're zoned through 2050. We do this they do revisions of these plans on a basically 5 to 10 year basis. We're now in what's called the round 10 forecast. We have more capacity in our existing zoning than we have projected growth all the way through 2050. We're not even touching the maximum of housing units that we can produce. And this involves no going into neighborhoods and taking out existing affordable housing. This is just what we can do in areas where it's relatively easy to develop right now. And I would suggest, if Park and Planning was interested in doing this, they should focus on what we do with empty office parks, which we're looking at legislation that would help us acquire them and convert them to housing. They'd look at their zoning, which is obsessed with high rise everywhere. If you build only high rise, you pretty much ensure that you don't build any affordable housing. It's pretty much a guarantee, in fact, that nothing will be built that's affordable or actually attainable to the so-called missing middle. What's mostly being built, and just look at Bethesda, it's at price points that your kid who's coming out of school, which everybody says they're worried about, are they going to be able to find an apartment here? Pretty much no, as long as the focus is solely on large multifamily units, not even multifamily, it's large units that are primarily 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units. Park and Planning's done enough of that, and they've done it well beyond the walk shed. The walk shed is a half mile, not a mile as they pretend. And by the way, nobody else in the country pretends that it's a mile. Walk shed's a half mile. If they focused on the areas outside the walk shed, they would be well served to look at possibly removing some of the high-rise zoning and putting in zoning for mid-rise and townhouses, where they'd accomplish their goal of more middle affordable housing, as well as ownership types like townhouses, which could be built right around the cores of our growth areas. So they got other solutions. Their decision to go into neighborhoods, I thought, was ridiculous. And I will say more about it later. I promise you I'll give you more talking points.
Thank you, Mr. County Executive. Remember, members of the media, let's stick to the topic right now. Lionel Donovan, I believe you're with WSA 9. Good afternoon, Lionel.
Good afternoon. Yes, I also had a question for Mr. Elrich. In regards to something that I believe you spoke on before about this potential legislation that would put rent in escrow as landlords and tenants sort things out in court if needed. And if needed, the county would be able to step in and use that money to directly fix issues in conflicts that things need to be fixed, bypassing landlords. And I just wanted to ask Mr. Eldridge, what kind of message do you think this kind of legislation would send to landlords? And do you think this is something that's needed in the county in light of issues that have come up from apartment complexes in Montgomery County, most notably the Enclave?
Yeah. Scott, do you want to say anything about that to start? Or do you want me to?
I'll just say briefly, that you can add on whatever you'd like. As far as I understand the law, this provides a private right of action. I'm not a lawyer, but it provides a private right of action for tenants as individuals or tenants as groups to take a landlord to court to get satisfaction. And so it is always good to have another tool in the toolbox, arrow in the quiver, for tenants to try to deal with these kinds of situations, because we are currently limited under local and state law in how we're able to take action through notices of violations and citations. But if there's a recalcitrant landlord who does not respond to the violation and is not concerned about the citation, those go to court. But often it takes 6 months or more to get into court over those citations. And often the citations, if the landlord sometime within that 6 months has remediated the violation, a judge will often reduce or eliminate the citation. And so the citations are out there to help to encourage landlords to do the right thing, but they are not really effectively used by the court system as a penalty for not fixing the violation in a timely fashion. And so it is often helpful for there to be, in this jurisdiction and others, for there to be other tools that allow the tenants to also take action in situations where landlords aren't complying.
So I'll just add, some of the problems we deal are bigger than the individual units. So you get complaints from various units in a building. Some issues like elevators that continue to fail and not work for months or years are a real problem, and there's no tenant course of action that can do that. So allowing the tenants to take action collectively is really important. The county also has a repair and deduct law. The tenants could actually call in someone to repair their building if the landlord refuses to fix it, but that applies to the situation in the tenant's apartment, not necessarily a building-wide issue. So that's a limitation on the law, and it doesn't anticipate tenants being able to collectively to repair and deduct bigger issues, like, say, for example, putting your rent in an escrow account and paying for the repair of an elevator system so that once and for all it's working. They can't do, there's no path for collective action. So for the landlords, the few of them that are out there that refuse to maintain their buildings and take advantage of the court system so that they never have to take care of their buildings, we want to make sure we can provide a counterweight so that if the tenants are so aggrieved, they can take an action as a group, they can put money in escrow, and they can ensure that repairs are made in their building. My hope is that landlords will look at this and realize it'll be a lot less painful to fix the buildings in the first place and not make anybody go through it. But if people have to go through it, the county's here to help them get their act together and understand what the law requires and what the law is going to allow them to do. So I look forward to having this as an additional tool.
Thank you, Mr. County Executive. Thank you, Lionel. Do you have any follow-up questions, Lionel?
No, I don't. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Jeannie Bixby, Mobile 360, good afternoon. No question, Jeannie?
I do. I'm sorry. I hit to lower my hand instead of to unmute myself. I'm sorry. I do have a question. When it comes to the enclave situation, could we have a little bit more clarity on why it was just 10 families, how you all were able to help those 10 families stay there, and also what kind of the backup plan is for the additional families, what's being worked on now?
Sure. And let me clarify that we are still working with all of the families now in partnership with the state and the resettlement agencies. 10 is a preliminary number. We think we can prevent all of them. There's 36 households that are refugees at the enclave facing eviction right now. And as I said, some of them may have to relocate because their income isn't high enough to cover the rent at the enclave. And as we all know, it's difficult to find affordable housing in Montgomery County, so they may have to relocate to other areas of the state. But we think that of those whose income is sufficient to cover rent, that they will be able to stay. And that is a larger number of households. But the process is still evolving, and we are working with them to get in very good information about their situations and working with the Muslim Community Center to understand their challenges individually. But we hope to have updated information in the weeks to come. But our goal is to prevent all families from becoming unhoused. That is the work of Services to End and Prevent Homelessness. And I'm optimistic we can prevent all of them from losing housing. And for many of them, probably the majority of them, to be able to stay at the enclave.
Thank you, Jenny. Members of the media, any more questions for these officials today regarding the Trouble Property Report, affordable housing, and the efforts to assist the Afghan refugees? Any more questions about these topics? I guess not. We can continue with the media briefing, Mr. County Executive.
So again, thank you both for being on here today. It's really helpful, and hopefully we'll be able to make more progress on the enclave in particular, because that's really important to deal with this. We don't want to put people out in the street. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things in a little bit more detail, as I promised a little bit earlier. We're going to talk a little bit about the planning board and issues before the council now. And the first we're going to talk about is the one that's moving fastest and getting the least attention, and that's the growth and infrastructure policy, sometimes referred to as the GIP. When I was on the council, this was called the Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance. The name has been changed several times. In this case, the name actually matters because it clearly states what that growth policy had to be tied to, the commitment to provide adequate public facilities. That's why it had its name. If you were going to grow in the county, you're going to add housing in the county, you had to provide adequate schools, adequate transportation, all the other things that make these communities work. Over the years, starting when I was on the council, they began changing the name. of the adequate public facilities ordinance. It's no longer referred to as the adequate public facilities ordinance. It's been called subdivision staging policy. Before that, it was called growth policy. All those were deliberate efforts to separate in the public's mind this fact that it was supposed to be about adequate public facilities, that the county had a responsibility to provide adequate public facilities. Separating and changing the name was a way of kind of not signaling the public that this was about adequate public facilities, because otherwise they'd have been barraged at hearings about where are the adequate public facilities. Regardless of what you name it, it is still the adequate public facilities ordinance. And it's supposed to be that tool that ensures that growth is accompanied by adequate infrastructure. So as the county grows, schools and roads are adequate to support the increased development. One of the myths about the adequate public facilities ordinance was that it was designed to block development and it was designed to cause moratoriums. That was the effect of councils not building adequate public facilities. There would have been never any moratoriums if the council had addressed school capacity issues or transportation issues. But it's been separated by some people in the political world, and they talk about it as if, oh my God, the county had this policy to stop growth. It was not meant to stop growth. It was meant to make sure that growth came with the necessary infrastructure. It's not a moratorium that are the problems. It's the ongoing refusal of previous councils to provide the infrastructure our residents need and deserve. Throughout this progression of name changes, the key feature is that reduction of standards considered adequate, affecting infrastructure in general, and particularly transportation and schools. The planning board and council have all but evaporated transportation tests. So you can't be too congested for this policy. And it renders that notion of adequate public facilities meaningless. And the same problem is applied to schools. We do not raise enough money for school construction to meet its growth. That's why we have an enormous backlog in our capital budget for schools, because we're dealing with the need to either add schools or to expand schools. And it's affecting the infrastructure in general, particularly transportation and schools. Our other funds for this are our bonds, but our bonds have been very limited to for the last 6 years, I guess, $280 million a year. It's, flat spending for 6 years when the costs of construction have gone up pretty substantially. Those bonds this year should be closer to $340 million if we were keeping up with inflation, but they're not. And so when you're reducing the amount of money you get from the adequate public facilities ordinance and you're not growing your bonding, then you're not able to keep up with the infrastructure needs in this county. And the infrastructure was supposed to have been paid for by development, and they were supposed to pay their fair share, and that burden was not to be solely offloaded onto residents. But what we've watched over the years is more of this burden shifted onto residential property, and it shifted away from the property that was supposed to pay it. And without paying their fair share, there are only one of two things that happen. Either residents pay the costs, or the infrastructure simply doesn't get built, and it leaves us with inadequate schools and transportation. And because of the allergy to taxation on the public, which I get, the council has usually voted for the first one. We do not, we just simply pass on whatever costs we can, and we do not build the infrastructure we need, because that would mean we had to raise taxes on residents, and people don't want to do that. So you wind up without the infrastructure you need. I will say parenthetically, but also very directly, that same policy handicaps our ability to provide the infrastructure we need for growth, the way Virginia has. So it's had a double whammy effect on the council. So every 4 years, the planning board and the council review and approve a new growth policy and the accompanying legislation. 5 times since 2013, the planning board and the council have reduced the amount of revenues available for providing adequate public facilities. I want to clarify, this is not this council that has cut the revenues, but now this council has an opportunity to stop the undermining of the adequate public facilities ordinance, or to put another way, the council has the ability to make sure that the responsibility of developers isn't further reduced and the costs further passed on to taxpayers, or worst of all, that we do nothing about the problem and people just simply deal with a failing infrastructure and overcrowded schools. The planning board has sent to the council a growth and infrastructure policy that would again reduce revenues that are desperately needed. I agree that the current mechanism, impact taxes, are not the best tool for raising the revenue to pay for adequate development. But what I'm urging the council to do is to take a do no harm approach this year. That is, do no further reduction in revenues until there's an alternative mechanism in place. And for years now, I've been proposing some version of special taxing districts like those used in Northern Virginia to great success that could replace our impact taxes. And to be blunt about the impact fees, they make any project in Montgomery County more expensive than a project built in Virginia. Substituting development district taxes for impact fees would reduce the disproportionate burden on new development and not have the negative impact that the impact taxes have on financing projects. But the planning board continues to recommend reducing impact taxes without a replacement revenue source. I actually met with the planning director and I offered to meet with him this summer to talk about what they were looking at and to talk about alternative tax methods like they use in Virginia, and they just simply refused to have a meeting with me. So kind of hard to make policy in collaboration with people if they decide they don't have to talk to you about it. It's nice that they put a reference to putting a study group together for the coming year, but my view is you shouldn't reduce the revenues you have and do any more damage before you finish a comprehensive study of what we might be able to do that would be more beneficial to the residents, more beneficial to development, and give the county the opportunity to provide its infrastructure. So I'm hoping the council, as far as fees goes, takes a pass on any effort to reduce the fees. And maybe there's some structural things in there they can look at, but they shouldn't be reducing fees and they shouldn't be putting parts of the county that aren't currently in zones that minimize the fees into those zones at the behest of developers who simply know that if you put me in a different category, I don't have to pay fees. So I hope the council doesn't go that way. We've got enough trouble raising revenue for infrastructure. We should not be making the situation worse. And the second issue that's coming from the planning board to the council is the issue that's getting the most attention, which is attainable housing strategies. The council's had a series of listening sessions around the county. I think they heard a lot of concern from residents all around the county. I can tell you from the sense we've gotten for residents, most people had no idea that the planning board was going to propose rezoning about 82% of the single family zones in Montgomery County. Most people had no idea that this was coming to them. And here it is. In future weeks, I intend to talk a lot more about this plan and why it would be bad news for the county and for our residents. But this week, I want to make a few 4 or 5 overall comments. First place, at its core, this is unnecessary. Unlike some places in the country and in our region, we are not a city that has been fully built out. We're not a Seattle or a Portland or a Minneapolis that's a mature city. And if you want to redevelop or add capacity, you have to look at the built environment and figure out how to densify it. In contrast, Montgomery County master plans have enough zoned capacity to house more people than are projected to come here through 2050. I'll say that again. We're zoned for more people to come here than are going to come here by 2050. I have 2 slides that'll illustrate the point. This slide was from COG, and you'll note I love using other people's literature. And the slide, the argument was the region needs to reduce the number of planned housing units by over 75,000 additional units between now and 2030, and beyond the 245,000 that are currently forecast. And that's what COG does every few years. They update their forecast and how many people are coming here. Existing, and this is what the slide says, existing comprehensive plans, that's us, can accommodate this additional capacity. Zoning and plan changes may be necessary. The planning board took the approach of rezoning the entire single family county. That is so out of proportion to anything you needed to do to get 10,000 housing units. It's beyond belief. Plus, the simplest thing to do would have been to revise the estimate for 2030, which COG said was a mistake because they did not match the housing units to the jobs. They simply could have added 10,000 to the forecast and removed 10,000 from the future years going out to 2045 that's been forecast to be built then. So they had other ways of dealing with this, and they chose the most unreasonable way, which is to use this as an excuse to rezone the single family parts of the county. A number of years ago, this is March 18th, 2015. This is how long some of this nonsense has been going on. There's a flow chart and it shows how the process works, and they get these forecasts from the local governments, they get forecasts from an econometric model. So this is something every jurisdiction in the DC region that's parts of COG, it's what they do. They do local forecasts of how much is going to be built. And then they reconcile the two, and then they create a regional forecast. So I was alarmed when this was introduced, because the way it's typically introduced, and we still do this, is, oh my God, all these people are coming here. What are we going to do? Which totally ignores the process of how they got to these numbers in the first place. So I was a council member then, and I asked Mr. Jardin, who was the lead person on this for COG, said the regional econometric model in the blue box, are you projecting jobs and employment by county or by TAZ zone? And TAZ zones are these traffic analysis zones that every county is divided into, and it's like hundreds of these zones. And Mr. Desjardins answered, he said, no, we do it at the regional scale only. It's an econometric model for the metropolitan area. So then I asked, so the local forecasts come out of the local planning boards? And he said, yes, you're correct. This is what the planning boards do. They look at the zoning that's on the ground, and they estimate how much of that zoning will be built in 5-year intervals over 30 years. That's the process. Every 5 years over 30 years. They are using the existing zoned envelope. Nobody believes that the 87,000 housing units they project needed by 2050 are going to be built in 1 year. Obviously, they're going to be built as demand comes, as the population grows. But this is the process. This is the local forecasts come out of the planning board. So when somebody tells you these people are coming here, it's because the planning boards have examined and evaluated their own planning and determined this is how much they think is going to be built in these 5-year intervals. So this county has got enough zoned land to do this. We have most of the zoned land that hasn't been built is not for high rise, fortunately, which means that housing units are going to be more affordable. And as I said before, if the county wanted to change what's been planned for, I think the planning board could look at the areas where they've put far too much high rise and focus around the areas that are farther away from the transit cores and rezone those areas more toward low rise buildings and townhouses, which can be much more affordable and address the missing middle, as opposed to looking at the neighborhoods to address the missing middle. Another way of putting it is they're asking developers to contribute nothing to the missing middle problem that's been created by the zoning the planning board put in place, and they're putting this burden entirely on the residents of the county. That's not right, and it doesn't make sense. And as far as affordability goes, I was on this interview with a reporter last week, and the announcer who segued us in said, and this was about affordable housing. And it's really frustrating because this plan not only doesn't address affordable housing. If you look at this slide below, this is from Park and Planning, it says, is this affordable housing? The answer from the planning board is no. The prices of newly built homes will be determined by the market. Well, the average house in the market in Montgomery County right now, new house is over $1 million. If this is affordable housing, I don't know what planet you're living on. Additionally, in a study from 3 years ago, the planning board looked at Silver Spring in 2021 and it concluded the new townhouses would cost back then between $700,000 and $855,000. They're already exceeding that amount. They've been built. And the average income, we want to point out, of Black and Hispanic residents is about $75,000. So once again, they're not moving into these communities. In fact, you might ask generally if you have a housing policy that does not have an affordable housing component and doesn't increase the amount of affordable housing you're trying to get, then it's pretty obvious to conclude who you're deciding is not going to live there. This is the data. This is all coming from data that's available through Park and Planning. The study was their study. They did another study on White Flint. They asked the developers why they weren't building because they're zoned for tons of housing. And the answer they got is the rents aren't high enough. They can't get enough money. So we've got an affordable housing problem. This plan does nothing to address the biggest part of the problem. And it puts this burden on residences and it makes no accounting of infrastructure. Secondly, equally disturbing, or maybe more disturbing, it's hard to say at this point. We looked at a townhome that was developed in Bethesda recently. There was a single family house that it had a large lot, and that house was sold to a developer for $1.6 million. So they put in 3 townhouses. Did they put 3 townhouses on that were worth $1.6 million? No. What they did is they took down the house, they put a triplex in, and the units in the triplex, each one sells for $3.6 million. So a $1.6 million house into a $3.6 million house. I don't know what message this sends to anybody else who owns property in that neighborhood, but if you're feeling squeezed and you want to get out and people are going to spend a fortune for your property in order to generate $3.6 million per house in the new development, you're not getting any missing middle housing and you're not getting any affordable housing. And it just raises the question about what exactly is Park and Planning trying to accomplish with this. Also, people need clear notice of the Affordable Housing Initiative. The large turnouts reflect only a small percentage of people who have been affected. And if it were to pass as currently proposed, these residents would have no say because the development process is going to be by right. Most people had no idea that the bulk of the single family communities in the county were being rezoned. Nobody told them that. Park and Planning didn't do a countywide mailer and said, your neighborhood's about to be rezoned. You might want to know about this and give us input. None of that was done. The council president has said there's no legislation scheduled for the council, but the proposal has been sent to the council and it's with them for review. That's what the listening sessions are about. And originally this bill was supposed to come over as part of Thrive, but when residents got concerned that Thrive was going to set the stage for exactly this, the council separated Thrive from the other bill, from this bill, and they introduced Thrive first, and then they did this bill starting a year and a half later. So just saying, this is what people were talking about in the beginning, and planning board said, oh no, we're not going to do this. And as soon as Thrive passed, this is what they said about doing. The third problem is this proposal is premature. It's based on a theory, not on solid based real world assessments. I've talked to real estate agents and they're insistent that if you go into a neighborhood and the neighborhood average price is $800,000 or $900,000, nobody's building townhouses under that price. You don't go into investment to make less than what you can get in the market, in the market that you're building in. And there's no realistic expectation that people are going to get affordable units out of this. So the plan undoes most of the master plans, and through the master plan process, which affords opportunities for residents to weigh in and carefully review impacts to its neighborhoods and infrastructure, which brings me to my fourth point here: adequate infrastructure and environmental consequences. There have been no studies on AHI's impact on the environment, but we do know that if we go into single family neighborhoods, which have fair amounts of green coverage, most lots are 65% not with the building. What happens to the trees and what happens to the stormwater? The more impervious surface that we build, and if you look at any of the plans they show, you will see lots of impervious surface where there was none before. The more impervious surface you build, the harder you make it on our stormwater system to handle the water. Park and Planning decided it was not worth their effort to do any study of what the impacts would be there. And we know what the impacts are going to be. And we have a study that's being done because we've got a flooding problem in the county now. There's a study being done to look at that. With climate change, our neighborhoods are already facing increasing flooding and overflowing storm drains. Additionally, there's no impact on infrastructure. So where's the parking going to be? I've been on streets where you could not possibly add more cars to the street because a lot of these neighborhoods, people do not have off-street parking. They're parking in front of their houses. So what happens if one house becomes a quad? Where exactly do all these cars park? And there is no parking requirement for the housing that's being proposed. There's been no transportation study. So if you're going to add all these people, say to Georgia Avenue or Connecticut Avenue or any other place, what's the impact on traffic? Parking planners refuse to do a study. And we know that if you added, say, $10,000 housing units into a corridor, if it's not near a metro, if it's just near even a BRT station or bus station, you'll be hard put to get above 20 or 25% ridership, which means 75% of what's new is going on the roads. And if you're not analyzing what the impact of all that is going to be on roads, then you're really underestimating whatever the impacts of this are. Master plans aren't done in this amateurish way. Master plans are done where you actually consider all the impacts from everything you plan on doing. And here the planning board's proposing major changes and doing no analysis of what the impacts are going to be. And they also don't have a cost impact of what the infrastructure would be. So assume you did this, what would it cost the county? You get a hint of this from the Thrive discussion. The county had the job of coming up with the estimates for what it would take to accommodate Thrive. And they brought a number back to the council and the planning board. And the reaction from the planning board chair and then council member Reamer was, we don't believe the number. Well, that's great. I always make policy based on what I believe about things I haven't studied. This is not the way you make public policy, and it's not fair to the residents of the county. It would be a massive undertaking to rezone 82% of our single family residential housing. It's affecting 164,000 homes. And one thing that I'd say the last thing that concerns me is they talk both sides out of the mouth. 1 minute, this is desperately needed to solve the housing crisis, which is, I think I've shown you, we have already able to solve, that they need this to do that. On the other hand, the planning director's in front of audiences and saying, well, this is really focused on teardowns, and we only do about 200 teardowns a year. It's either a massive program to produce housing, or it's a trivial program to produce a couple of housing units a year. Either way, it's not much housing. And it's really disturbing that they pick their argument for whatever audience they're in front of. Not a good way to make policy. We all agree, I think, that housing affordability is a major concern, both for people who want to become homeowners as well as renters. Unfortunately, this proposal does not help them, and it threatens to damage our beautiful and diverse county. I think if people are concerned about existing housing units and asking themselves, where are my children going to live? And the answer from the planning board is we're going to build more housing units that are at market. It pretty much tells you your children aren't going to live here if that's the kind of housing they plan on building. I've already talked about some of our recent work on affordable housing, and there's a lot more. Last week, we welcomed Maryland Secretary of Housing and Community Development, Jake Day, to Montgomery County. We showed him some of what we're doing here. We visited the newly opened Leggett in Silver Spring, a mixed income development for seniors that's adjacent to our aquatic center and rec center. We showed him our art space, which offers both ownership and rental units. It was designed and developed in collaboration with the community. We showed him the project on Randolph Road that the county initiated that's going to build about 195 all affordable units for people between incomes between 30 and 80% of the median income in the county. Truly affordable housing for a wide range of residents. And we showed them one of the newest projects, HOC's Hillendale Gateway in the East County. This will be an all-electric mixed income and mixed use development. It's a complicated project that involved HOC, Montgomery County Green Bank, private investors, Montgomery County. And because of this collaboration, 54% will be affordable to families earning 30 to 80% of AMI. This is the kind of housing that addresses the needs of young people coming into the county whose incomes are likely to be 80% of AMI or lower. Attainable housing doesn't address any of that. So there's a lot more I could say on this, a lot more I'm going to say over time, but I'm going to pause now. Just take any questions you guys want about attainable housing at this point.
Members of the media, any questions regarding attainable housing at this point? Questions? Do we have a health update today, Dr. Davis?
We have a quick health update.
Okay.
Today, I joined with members of the county council and other community leaders to get an updated COVID-19 vaccination. You can see some of us here. We did it at the Giant on Cherry Hill Road in Silver Spring, received the Novavax version of the vaccine, and it's the only one available in the United States that was developed the traditional way. It's a protein-based vaccine, and hopefully that will convince many more people to get the vaccine. I think we know there are a lot of people who would not get vaccinated because the vaccines are predominantly mRNA. In fact, in the beginning, the only vaccines were mRNA based. There are people who had health concerns or safety concerns about the mRNA vaccines. I believe, as pretty much everybody does who studied it, that all the vaccines are effective, all the vaccines are good, and you can take any one of them. But Novavax's vaccine is a protein-based vaccine. We hope we'll get those last remaining residents who held out because they didn't have a protein-based vaccine will come and get the Novavax vaccine, which is equally effective in preventing severe COVID and long-term COVID, but is made in the traditional way, which people are comfortable with. Those are the vaccines that pretty much probably all of us on this phone call grew up with. And it's an accepted and widely recognized vaccine manufacturing technique. We did this event at the Giant and Cherry Hill Road, and we got the Novavax version of the vaccine. And we're hoping that this helps county residents who have stayed outside of the vaccination window to come and get vaccinated. We continue to see cases of COVID. The illness rate, severity of illness, and the death rate from COVID far exceeds the flu. And the people who are feeling it or experiencing it are the people who haven't been vaccinated or who haven't been getting regular vaccinations, because the COVID morphs itself and doesn't respond to every vaccine. People who got vaccines a few cycles ago may not have the protection that come with the vaccine that's out there today. So we're urging people, please come get vaccinated, period. If you've been holding off because you want a traditionally manufactured vaccine, Novavax is a vaccine that will address your concerns. We want you to address your concerns because we want you to be healthful. And if this is what it takes to get you to get this vaccine, we hope you will. It'll help keep you safer. It'll help keep the people around you safer. And I will now turn it over to my team for any updates.
Thank you, Mr. County Executive. Just a great event. I want to echo the importance of vaccines. The best COVID vaccine is the one that you get. And so we are really lucky to have such a partner like Novavax, who's in the county with us, and a leader in healthcare provider. I do want to just echo and reiterate the importance. If you've been waiting and wondering when is the best time to get those fall vaccines like COVID and influenza, now is a great time to give protection through the fall and winter holidays. If someone did recently have COVID, because we know we're just coming down on the tail end of a COVID wave, you do want to wait a couple months so that you have the best immunity. You still have some protection from the infection that you might have just gotten over, but you do still want to get a COVID vaccine. And we know that the COVID vaccine that is out now is updated. This is why we get it each year, because it's updated to the strand that is circulating now. So we encourage folks to get that. It is the best way to protect yourself. We know that it decreases hospitalizations and death from COVID, but it's also the best way to protect the community and to protect those who are most vulnerable. So if we don't want to keep seeing these COVID waves and rises, getting the vaccine is the best protection and tool in our toolbox to help with that. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Members of the media, any questions regarding the health update or any other topics? At this time, please your hands. Oh, there's Judy first, the Greater Olney News. Good afternoon, Judy.
Hi, good afternoon. I almost don't know how to ask this question, because I've been around long enough to remember how important the adequate public facilities ordinance was to Montgomery County. They were very proud of that, making sure that they had what they needed anytime they had development. My readers are horrified by this, idea of putting in housing anywhere. In your opinion, Mr. County Executive, why is no one seeing how important having something like the APFO is anymore.
Because nobody talks about it, Judy. You know, this is what happened when the council changed the name deliberately, because it triggered expectations that, my God, the council would have to provide adequate public facilities. So what about this? Your projection is this road is going to be congested. What are you going to do to keep it? You're going to overcrowd the schools. What are you going to do to overcrowd the schools? So they didn't want to have those questions. And so they created a name that makes you think you're simply staging subdivision or it's your growth policy. But they broke the tie between people's expectations of adequate public facilities. And that was deliberate. And I'm sure if you ask people back then who were the leaders of this, they'd say, oh, we didn't mean anything by that. We just thought this was a better name. It was a better name because it didn't make you accountable for the kind of planning you were doing. And it's allowed people not to think about it. And people, if you're not engaged in this regularly, it's hard to keep up on. We got a lot of new residents since I think the APFO was passed, I think it was 1973 or something like that.
Mhm.
And so a lot of time has gone by and people don't know that. People don't know should have an expectation that if the government's doing something, that it's going to ensure that the infrastructure is adequate to accommodate it. And the council got rid of it because, and I tried to say this in my comments, if you're faced with schools and transportation growth, you have to build something. And the challenge was, how are you going to pay for it? Well, the growth policy, all the things in there required developers to provide schools and provide for the bulk of the transportation. People come under pressure from developers that, you've loaded these costs on this. I think the mantra is, you're increasing the cost of a project. And it's, so our projects can be more expensive. Well, the flip side of that is if you don't pay it, only one of two things happen. I tried to say this before. You either pass the tax on to the residents, because in Montgomery County right now, and I hope we change this, there's the same tax rate on commercial property as on residential property. So you can't tax commercial property without also taxing residential property. And since most of the money you raise in taxes comes from residential property, it means the burden would have been shifted successfully onto residents. The other alternative is the path that the county's probably most largely followed, which is not adequately funding anything. So that's why our bond rates are stuck at 280 million, because we don't keep up with inflation. Because if we did that, we'd have to increase our tax revenues. And if you're not willing to go to developers for any of this money, then the only people you can look to are residents. And so we wind up not doing anything at all because it's too politically difficult to tax residents. And it is, so if you're not being taxed, you don't see what's not being built. You don't notice what you didn't get until the moment that you look at an intersection and saying, why is it like this? Or why is my kid sitting in a class with 35 students when I thought the county standard was 25? You don't see these things until they land. And meanwhile, you can't go back and get the money from the people who should have paid. I do think, and I'll be honest with you, I've been talking for years about getting rid of the impact taxes, but you shouldn't get rid of them until you come up with a system of taxation that's fairer and that can replace the revenues so the county can do its job of providing adequate infrastructure. And we've not been able to have that conversation here. And I've tried to raise it. I've raised it with the previous council. I raised it with this council. Virginia has a much better taxing system. They have these special taxing districts. They largely exclude new residential development from those districts. So most of the taxes lie on the commercial sector, but those taxes lead to building schools. So their schools aren't overcrowded, and they lead to building transportation projects so that their people are able to have mobility or get the Silver Line, which is, a way different kind of mode of transportation than what we've been able to build here so far. Our bus rapid transit plan has been in the works for over a dozen years now. And we've never had the money to build even a single inch of true bus rapid transit in the county because they don't have the revenues to do it. Virginia tackled the major subway system and BRTs in multiple counties, and they tackled that because they had a tax base that was more skewed to raising money from commercial property. So we're not looking to raise taxes enormously. I am trying to avoid putting any of these taxes on residents. I do think that we need to get more from commercial property. And the last thing I'll say is, Apparently in Virginia, the developers had the vision to go with the Fairfax County Council and lobby the Republican legislature and the Republican governor to pass the tax authority that the Northern Virginia counties now have. They got it out of a Republican legislature and a Republican governor. When the Republican governor signed the bill, he talked about how much economic development was going to happen in Northern Virginia because of their investment in infrastructure. We faced the exact same dilemma. When we had the chances to move in that direction, we've balked at it every single time. And so if you want to understand the difference between us and say Fairfax and Tyson's Corner, people aren't fleeing to Tyson's Corner so they can pay $1.51 in property taxes versus $1.04 in property taxes in Montgomery County. They're going to Tyson's Corner because they got serious about building infrastructure. They built an environment that attracted investment, and we don't seem to have the willingness to do that. Our solution to everything is let's lower the price on development and maybe they will come. Let's increase the density and maybe they will come. And I'll say after my 12 years on the council and all the density we increased under this mantra, we're still looking at a totally flat growth rate in jobs and housing. So obviously density was not the answer. And I don't know why after 15 or 17, maybe 17 years now, why people are still thinking density is going to solve a problem that other people have solved by actually building things that developers want to see. So I could go on, but it's really infuriating and it's not fair to the residents. It's not fair to put this load on them. It's not fair to say, well, your neighborhood it's a bad thing that you live in a single family neighborhood. These are bad things we have in the county and we should get rid of them. And I can tell you there are planning board members who absolutely are anti-single family house and would be more than happy to densify and turn the entire county into a city, which without a grid of roads is going to be impossible. Anyway, I digress.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thank you, Mr. Connie, Executive. Members of the media, any additional questions this afternoon? No more questions? Going once, going twice. I guess we're done for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Stay safe. Have a pleasant afternoon, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
590 AM on the Interstate 270 corridor, WPDD 1070 AM on the US 29 corridor,